I was pouring my morning coffee when I heard the knock at my front door, the kind of aggressive rat-a-tat-tat that made my chickens squawk in alarm from their coop behind the house. It was barely 7 in the morning on a Saturday, and I already knew this wasn't going to be good news. When I opened the door, there she stood, clipboard in hand, wearing a lime green blazer that could probably be seen from space, and an expression that suggested she'd just discovered something deeply offensive to her very existence. "Quinn Yates?" she asked, though her tone suggested it was more of an accusation than a question. "That's me," I said, taking a sip of my coffee and trying to appear more awake than I felt. "I'm Brenda Patterson, president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association. We need to talk about the numerous violations you've been committing on your property." She thrust a stack of papers at me, each one meticulously organized in plastic sheet protectors. I took the papers and flipped through them, my eyebrows rising with each page. Violations. "Lady, I've been living here for 6 months and this is the first I'm hearing about any problems." "That's because we've been giving you the courtesy of a grace period," Brenda said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "But that period has now expired. As you can see, we've documented 17 separate violations, all stemming from your illegal farm operation." I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. "Farm operation? I have 6 chickens, 2 goats, and a couple of ducks. My kids help me take care of them. It's hardly a commercial farming enterprise." Brenda's face turned a shade of red that clashed spectacularly with her blazer. "The HOA covenants are very clear about livestock. They are strictly prohibited within community boundaries." "Then maybe you should have mentioned that before I bought the house," I said, feeling my own irritation rising. "I specifically asked about keeping animals during the purchase process. The realtor assured me it was fine." "The realtor was mistaken," Brenda snapped. "And ignorance of the rules is no excuse. You have 14 days to remove all livestock from your property or face daily fines of $500. She turned on her heel and marched back to her silver SUV, which she'd parked blocking my driveway. I stood there holding the stack of papers, watching her drive away, and felt a mix of anger and disbelief wash over me. I'd moved to Meadowbrook Hills, a rural community just outside Lexington, Kentucky, specifically because I wanted space for my kids to grow up with animals and fresh air. The property was 3 acres, surrounded by farmland and horse pastures. Half the neighbors in the development had chickens or small livestock. This made no sense. I called my lawyer that Monday morning. Frank Chen had handled my house closing and came highly recommended from a friend who dealt with contractor disputes. When I explained the situation, he was quiet for a moment before responding. "Quinn, I'm looking at your purchase documents right now. I pulled them up when you called. There's no mention of livestock restrictions in any of the paperwork. In fact, the property is zoned agricultural residential, which specifically allows for small-scale animal husbandry." "That's what I thought," I said, pacing my kitchen while my 2 kids, Marcus and Sophie, ate breakfast at the table. They were 10 and 8, respectively, and had been devastated when I'd mentioned we might have to get rid of the animals. "So what do I do? First, don't remove the animals. Second, I'm going to send a response to the HOA informing them that your use of the property is consistent with both the zoning designation and the absence of any livestock prohibition in the covenants that were provided at closing. Third, I want you to start documenting everything. Photos, videos, copies of any correspondence. If they push this, we need a paper trail." Over the next week, Brenda Patterson made her presence known in increasingly aggressive ways. She drove by my house at least 3 times a day, sometimes slowing to take photos with her phone. She left notes on my door citing new violations including improper fence height, unauthorized garden structures, which was my kid's small vegetable plot with tomato cages, and excessive noise from the animals, even though my nearest neighbor was 200 yards away and had told me he enjoyed hearing the rooster crow in the mornings. The HOA sent me a formal hearing notice for the following Thursday evening. I was required to appear before the board to address the violations or face immediate fines and potential legal action. Frank advised me to attend and let him handle the talking. The hearing was held in the community center, a bland building near the neighborhood entrance that I'd never actually visited before. When Frank and I arrived, the parking lot was nearly full. I recognized about 15 of my neighbors filing into the building, and several of them gave me encouraging nods or waves. Inside, the meeting room was set up like a courtroom, with a long table at the front where 5 board members sat looking important and uncomfortable in equal measure. Brenda sat in the center, flanked by 2 women and 2 men who all appeared to be in their 50s or 60s. About 40 residents filled the folding chairs facing the board. "This meeting of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA is now in session," Brenda announced, banging a small gavel that seemed ridiculous given the informal setting. "First order of business is the matter of Quinn Yates and his ongoing violations of community covenants." Frank stood. "If I may, Madam President, I'm Frank Chen, representing Mr. Yates. Before we proceed, I'd like to understand which specific covenant provision you believe my client is violating." Brenda shuffled through papers, her expression turning pinched. "Section 12, subsection 4, which prohibits any use of property that creates nuisance conditions for neighboring residents." "That's a nuisance provision, not a livestock prohibition," Frank said smoothly. "And I have signed statements from Mr. Yates's 3 closest neighbors indicating that they have no complaints about his animals, and in fact appreciate the rural character they bring to the community. May I submit these for the record?" He handed copies to the board. I watched Brenda's jaw clench as she scanned the documents. "Furthermore," Frank continued, "the property in question is zoned R agricultural residential by Campbell County. This zoning explicitly permits the keeping of small livestock for personal use. Mr. Yates has 6 chickens, 2 miniature goats, and 3 ducks. This falls well within the parameters of residential agricultural use." One of the male board members, whose nameplate identified him as Richard Holmes, cleared his throat. "Mr. Chen, while we appreciate the zoning information, the HOA covenants supersede county zoning for purposes of neighborhood standards." "That would be true if the covenants actually prohibited livestock," Frank said, "but they don't. I've reviewed every version of the Meadowbrook Hills covenants filed with the county since the development was established in 1987. Not one mentions livestock, farm animals, or agricultural restrictions. The only animal-related provision is in Section 9, which limits residents to 4 household pets. Farm animals kept for agricultural purposes are not classified as pets under Kentucky law." The room erupted in murmurs. Brenda's face was getting progressively redder. "This is absurd. Everyone knows that livestock aren't allowed in residential neighborhoods." "Actually, Mrs. Patterson, that's not true," a voice called from the audience. An older man stood up, someone I recognized as living in the original section of the development. "I'm George Mitchell. I've lived here for 32 years. When Meadowbrook was first developed, it was marketed as a rural residential community. People had horses, chickens, even a few cows. The whole point was country living close to town. It wasn't until you took over as HOA president 5 years ago that anyone started making a fuss about animals. Several other longtime residents voiced agreement. Another woman stood and pointed out that she'd had chickens for 15 years without complaint until Brenda had sent her a violation notice 6 months ago. She'd gotten rid of them, she said with obvious regret, because she couldn't afford to fight the HOA. Brenda banged her gavel repeatedly. "This is out of order. We're here to address Mr. Yates's violations, not to debate the history of the community." "Then let's stick to the facts," Frank said. "Fact 1. The covenants contain no livestock prohibition. Fact 2. The property is legally zoned for agricultural residential use. Fact 3. My client is in full compliance with all county regulations regarding animal keeping, including setback requirements, sanitation standards, and number of animals per acre. Fact 4. There is no evidence of any actual nuisance. On what legal basis is this board claiming a violation?" The board members looked at each other uncomfortably. Richard Holmes leaned over to whisper something to Brenda, who shook her head violently. "We have the authority to amend the covenants as needed to maintain property values and community standards," Brenda finally said. "You do," Frank agreed. "But those amendments must be properly proposed, noticed, and voted on by the membership. You can't retroactively enforce rules that don't exist. If you attempt to fine Mr. Yates or take any action against him based on these phantom violations, we will file suit for harassment and seek damages, including attorney fees." The meeting devolved from there. Other residents began raising concerns about various decisions Brenda had made as president. Someone complained about being fined for having a vegetable garden visible from the street. Someone else objected to requirements about approved paint colors that seemed to change based on Brenda's personal preferences. The board was forced to table my violation hearing without taking action, and Frank and I left feeling cautiously optimistic. That optimism lasted exactly 3 days. On Sunday morning, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. The HOA was not only proceeding with fines, but had also filed a complaint with the Campbell County Code Enforcement Office claiming I was operating an illegal farm in violation of zoning regulations. They'd somehow convinced the county to schedule an inspection. "This is pure retaliation," Frank said when I called him, "but it might actually work in our favor. If the county inspects and confirms you're in compliance with zoning, it undermines the HOA's entire argument." The inspector arrived on Tuesday. His name was Tom Bradley, a friendly man in his 40s who spent 30 minutes walking my property, checking my animal enclosures, and reviewing my documentation. I showed him my feed receipts, vaccination records, and the detailed plans I'd drawn up for proper drainage and waste management. "Mr. Yates, everything looks good here," Tom said, making notes on his tablet. "You've got 8 animals on 3 acres, which is well below the density limit. Your coops and pens meet setback requirements. You've got proper fencing and no evidence of waste runoff. This is actually one of the better small livestock setups I've seen. A lot of people don't bother with the drainage considerations. So I'm in compliance, completely. I'm going to file a report saying exactly that. Between you and me, I'm not sure why this complaint was filed in the first place. The person who called it in seemed to think you were running some kind of factory farm, but this is clearly just a family keeping a few animals." I could have kissed him. Instead, I thanked him profusely and immediately sent photos of his inspection report to Frank. But Brenda Patterson wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The following week, I received notice that the HOA was holding an emergency special meeting to vote on an amendment to the covenants that would explicitly prohibit all livestock within community boundaries. The vote was scheduled for the next month, and all homeowners would be eligible to vote either in person or by proxy. They need 75% approval to amend the covenants, Frank explained. Start talking to your neighbors. This is going to come down to whether people support you or support the board. I'd never been much of a politician, but the situation forced me to become one. I spent the next 3 weeks going door to door, talking to every neighbor I could find. What I discovered was illuminating. Brenda had been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom for years, and a lot of people were fed up. The chicken lady I'd met at the hearing, whose name was Patricia Moore, turned out to be something of a community organizer. She started a phone tree and organized an informal group of residents who opposed the livestock ban. "This isn't really about your animals," Patricia told me over coffee at her kitchen table. "It's about Brenda trying to turn this community into something it was never meant to be. She wants Meadowbrook to look like one of those fancy planned developments with identical houses and golf courses. But we're not that. We're people who chose to live here because we wanted space and freedom." Marcus and Sophie had become minor celebrities in the neighborhood. Kids loved visiting to see the chickens and goats, and I started hosting informal tours on Saturday mornings. Parents appreciated the educational opportunity, and watching children collect eggs or help feed the goats turned out to be excellent public relations. Brenda fought back with a letter campaign, sending glossy flyers to every house warning of decreased property values, health hazards, and the potential for aggressive animals. She cited dubious statistics and included photos of industrial farming operations that bore no resemblance to my small setup. She even claimed that allowing farm animals would attract predators like coyotes and foxes, ignoring the fact that we lived in rural Kentucky, where those animals were already present. The week before the vote, things took a darker turn. I came home from work to find my chicken coop's gate open and 2 of my hens missing. The latch had been deliberately broken. I checked my security camera footage and saw a figure in dark clothing approaching the coop around 2 in the morning, but the image quality wasn't clear enough to identify who it was. I filed a police report, though the deputy who took the statement seemed skeptical that it was anything more than vandalism or even an animal predator that had learned to open gates. But 3 days later, someone cut a section of fence around my goat pen. Fortunately, I discovered it before the goats escaped, but the message was clear. Frank advised me to upgrade my security system, which I did immediately. I installed high-definition cameras covering all the animal enclosures and added motion sensor lights. I also started sleeping lighter, listening for any unusual sounds. The night before the covenant vote, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept running numbers in my head. The community had 243 homes. We needed at least 61% to vote against the amendment to prevent it from passing. Patricia's group had identified about 150 definite no votes, but that assumed everyone actually showed up or sent in their proxies. The meeting was held in the Campbell County High School gymnasium because the community center wasn't large enough. When Frank and I arrived an hour early, there were already people setting up chairs and arguing about the arrangement. Brenda had brought in a professional moderator and what looked like legal counsel of her own. As people filed in, I tried to gauge the mood. I recognized supporters and opponents, but there were also a lot of neutral faces, people I hadn't managed to talk to despite my efforts. The attendance was incredible, over 300 people including homeowners and their spouses. I'd never seen this level of community engagement for anything. The moderator called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. He explained the voting procedures, the proposed amendment, and the arguments for and against. Brenda was given 15 minutes to present the case for the livestock ban. She started with property values, citing a study from some Homeowners Association institute about the negative impact of farm animals on residential real estate prices. Then she moved to health concerns, talking about diseases that could spread from chickens and the potential for contaminated groundwater from animal waste. She finished with quality of life issues, painting a picture of a neighborhood overrun with noisy, smelly animals. We all chose to live in Meadowbrook Hills because we wanted a certain standard of living, Brenda said, her voice taking on a passionate intensity. Allowing farm animals degrades that standard. It turns us from a respectable community into a rural slum. Is that what you want when you look out your windows? Chicken coops and goat pens instead of manicured lawns? When it was my turn, I kept it simple. Frank had advised me not to get too technical or legal. Instead, I told my story. I moved here 6 months ago because I wanted my kids to grow up understanding where their food comes from and learning responsibility, I said. Marcus and Sophie collect eggs every morning before school. They've learned to care for living creatures, to understand the work that goes into sustainable living. Our goats, Peanut and Butter, provide us with milk and fertilizer for our garden. They're family members who teach my children empathy and hard work. I paused, looking around the room. But this isn't just about me. This is about what kind of community we want to be. Do we want to be the kind of place where neighbors support each other's choices, where families have the freedom to live according to their values? Or do we want to be controlled by arbitrary rules that serve no purpose, except to enforce one person's vision of what a neighborhood should look like? I held up the county inspector's report. Campbell County reviewed my property and found full compliance with every regulation. My neighbors have signed statements saying the animals cause no problems. The original covenants never prohibited livestock because the founders of this community understood that rural residential living means respecting different lifestyles. Passing this amendment would fundamentally change what Meadowbrook Hills is, and not for the better. Patricia spoke next, sharing her own experience of being forced to get rid of her chickens. Then George Mitchell gave a passionate speech about the history of the community and how it had always embraced agricultural elements. Several other residents spoke in support, including a veterinarian who dismantled Brenda's health concerns and a real estate agent who disputed her property value claims. The opposition had their speakers too. A couple who lived near the community entrance worried about the impression farm animals would make on visitors. Someone complained about rooster noise, even though the person didn't live anywhere near me. Another resident simply felt that livestock didn't belong in any HOA community, period. After nearly 3 hours of discussion, the moderator called for the vote. It could be done by show of hands since everyone present had checked in and verified their ownership status. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. All those in favor of adopting the proposed amendment to prohibit livestock, please raise your hands. I held my breath as hands went up throughout the gymnasium. The moderator's assistants walked around with counters, clicking as they tallied. It seemed to take forever. All those opposed to adopting the proposed amendment, please raise your hands. More hands went up. I couldn't tell if there were more or fewer than the first group. My heart was pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. The moderator conferred with his assistants, checking their counts and doing calculations on a tablet. The room was absolutely silent. The results are as follows, he finally announced. 287 valid votes were cast. In favor of the amendment, 108. Opposed to the amendment, 179. The amendment fails to achieve the required 75% approval and is therefore rejected. The gymnasium erupted in cheers and applause, though a significant portion of the room sat in stony silence. I felt like I might pass out from relief. Frank clapped me on the shoulder, grinning. Brenda stood up, her face a mask of fury. "This is not over," she said loudly enough to carry over the noise. "There are other avenues to pursue. This community will not become a barnyard, I promise you that." She stormed out, followed by her contingent of supporters. The moderator tried to restore order to discuss other HOA business, but the meeting effectively dissolved. People crowded around me, shaking my hand and congratulating me. Patricia hugged me fiercely. "You did it," she said. "We did it." I went home that night feeling victorious, but also uneasy. Brenda's parting threat had been specific and threatening. I didn't think this was truly over. I was right to be worried. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from the Campbell County Attorney's Office. Brenda Patterson, in her capacity as HOA president, had filed for a zoning variance review, essentially asking the county to reconsider whether my property should be classified as agricultural residential. She was arguing that the entire Meadowbrook Hills development should be rezoned as Residential 1, which would prohibit farm animals. "This is insane," I told Frank. "Can she actually do this?" "She can request it," Frank said. "Whether the county will entertain it is another question." Rezoning an entire established development is a huge undertaking, but will need to respond and probably appear at the zoning board hearing. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, Brenda escalated her campaign. She appeared at the county commissioners' meeting to advocate for the rezoning. She wrote letters to the local newspaper, arguing that residential communities needed protection from agricultural encroachment. She even got a few local politicians to express concern about the issue, though none of them actually committed to supporting the rezoning. Frank and I prepared for the zoning board hearing like it was a trial. We gathered documentation about the history of Meadowbrook Hills, the original development plans that specifically marketed the community as rural residential, and expert testimony about appropriate zoning classifications. We also lined up residents to speak in opposition to the rezoning. The Campbell County Zoning Board met in the county courthouse, a historic building in downtown Newport. The hearing was held in a wood-paneled room that probably hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The board consisted of 7 members, a mix of elected officials and appointed experts in planning and development. Brenda arrived with her lawyer, a stern woman named Margaret Holloway who specialized in real estate law. They'd prepared an extensive presentation complete with PowerPoint slides and printed materials for each board member. Margaret started the presentation by arguing that Meadowbrook Hills had evolved from its original rural character into a modern residential community. She showed photos of well-maintained homes, landscaped yards, and the community amenities like the pool and playground. Then she showed photos of my property, zooming in on the chicken coop and goat pen in a way that made them look more prominent than they actually were. The presence of farm animals is incompatible with the current character of this community, Margaret argued. While the original zoning may have made sense 30 years ago when the development was first established, the community has clearly evolved into a traditional suburban neighborhood. The zoning classification should reflect that reality. She went on to cite precedents from other counties where residential developments had been successfully rezoned to prohibit agricultural uses. She talked about the importance of consistent zoning standards and the county's interest in protecting property values. When it was our turn, Frank took a different approach. Instead of arguing about what Meadowbrook Hills had become, He focused on what it was legally established as and what the residents actually wanted. "The petitioner is asking you to override the will of the property owners," Frank said. 287 residents of Meadowbrook Hills voted on whether to prohibit livestock through their HOA covenants. 62% voted to allow them to continue. The petitioner, having lost that Democratic vote, is now asking the county to impose by government mandate what she couldn't achieve through community consensus. He pulled up property records showing that 12 households in Meadowbrook Hills currently kept chickens or other small livestock, all in full compliance with existing zoning regulations. Rezoning this property would force 12 families to give up animals they've legally kept for years. It would change the fundamental character of a community against the wishes of the majority of its residents. And for what purpose? There have been no complaints filed with code enforcement, no documented problems, no evidence of any harm caused by the current agricultural residential zoning. Patricia spoke next, representing the residents group that opposed rezoning. She brought a petition signed by over 150 homeowners opposing the change. George Mitchell gave another history lesson, this time bringing original marketing materials from when Meadowbrook Hills was first developed that explicitly promoted the community as perfect for people who wanted to keep horses or chickens. Then the veterinarian who'd spoken at the HOA meeting provided technical testimony about the feasibility and safety of small-scale livestock keeping in residential settings. A county extension agent testified that the agricultural residential zoning was specifically designed for exactly this type of situation, established neighborhoods with larger lots, where people wanted the option of keeping a few animals. The board members asked questions, some clearly skeptical of Brenda's petition and others seemingly more sympathetic. The chairwoman, a sharp-eyed woman named Dorothy Vincent, asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Mrs. Patterson, you're the HOA president, correct?" "Yes, that's correct," Brenda said. "And the HOA recently held a vote on whether to prohibit livestock through the covenant amendment process." "Yes, and that vote failed," Brenda's lawyer jumped in. "The HOA's internal governance is separate from county zoning issues. The zoning classification should be based on objective criteria about appropriate land use, not popularity contests." Dorothy raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't suggesting it was a popularity contest. I was asking about whether the actual residents of the community want this change. It seems relevant to our decision-making process." Another board member, a man named James Foster, leaned forward. "I'm looking at the complaint that triggered this petition. Mrs. Patterson, you filed a code enforcement complaint against Mr. Yates claiming he was operating an illegal farm. That complaint was investigated and found to be without merit. Now you're asking us to change the zoning to retroactively make your complaint valid. That's a concerning approach." "I'm asking you to correct an outdated zoning classification," Brenda said, her voice rising. "This isn't personal. It's about proper land use." "It seems pretty personal," Dorothy said dryly. "Mr. Yates, how many animals do you have?" 6 chickens, 2 miniature goats, and 3 ducks, I answered. "And how large is your property?" 3 acres. Dorothy looked at her fellow board members. "I'm having a hard time seeing how 11 small animals on 3 acres constitutes a zoning problem. Anyone else want to weigh in?" The discussion among the board members was telling. Most of them seemed irritated that they were being asked to intervene in what was clearly an HOA dispute. One member pointed out that rezoning an entire development of 243 homes, because one person objected to one neighbor's legal use of property, was a massive overreach. Another noted that if they approved this petition, They'd set a precedent that would lead to constant rezoning requests based on individual complaints. After about 20 minutes of deliberation, Dorothy called for a vote. It was 7-0 against the rezoning petition. She addressed Brenda directly. "Mrs. Patterson, the agricultural residential zoning classification exists precisely for communities like Meadowbrook Hills. The county is not going to rezone an entire development because you don't like what your neighbor is doing, especially when he's in full compliance with all regulations and has majority support from his community. This petition is denied. Furthermore, I'm strongly recommending that if you bring any similar petitions forward, we'll consider them frivolous and potentially subject you to the costs of these proceedings." Brenda's face went through several shades of red before settling on a deep purple. "This is outrageous. You're supposed to be protecting communities, not enabling people to turn neighborhoods into farms. We're supposed to make sound zoning decisions based on evidence and established land use principles," Dorothy said. "Not help HOA presidents win personal battles. This hearing is adjourned." In the hallway outside the hearing room, Brenda confronted me directly for the first time since this whole mess had started. "You've made a mockery of this community," she hissed, jabbing a finger at my chest. "You and your farm animals and your little supporters, but you haven't won. I'll make sure every day you live in Meadowbrook Hills is miserable. I'll find violations. I'll fine you for every little infraction. I'll make you wish you'd never moved there." Frank stepped between us. "Mrs. Patterson, what you just said constitutes harassment and threatening behavior. If you continue this vendetta against my client, we'll be filing a restraining order and a lawsuit for damages." Brenda laughed bitterly. "Sue me. Sue the HOA. See how that works out for you. HOAs have legal protections. We can make our residents' lives hell, and there's not much you can do about it." She stalked off, her lawyer following with an expression that suggested she was regretting taking this case. Over the next month, Brenda made good on her threats. I received violation notices for having my trash cans visible from the street 15 minutes before the scheduled pickup time. I was cited for having a weed in my front flower bed. I got fined because my house number wasn't the exact specified size according to a covenant provision I'd never heard of. Each violation came with a fine, and each fine required a formal hearing process to dispute. Frank sent increasingly stern letters to the HOA demanding they cease the harassment. Patricia and other board members started pushing back against Brenda at board meetings, questioning the validity of her constant violation notices against me, while other residents with similar issues were left alone. The tension in the community reached a boiling point. Then something happened that changed everything. I came home from work on a Thursday afternoon to find police cars in front of my house. My heart dropped into my stomach. My first thought was that something had happened to Marcus and Sophie, but they were at their mom's house this week. We shared custody 50-50. A deputy met me as I got out of my truck. "Are you Quinn Yates?" "Yes, what's wrong? Did something happen?" "Sir, we received a report that you've been making threats against Brenda Patterson. We need to ask you some questions." I felt like I'd been punched. "Threats? I haven't threatened anyone. What are you talking about?" The deputy showed me his notepad. "Mrs. Patterson filed a report saying you called her 3 times today, leaving threatening voicemails. Do you have your phone?" I pulled out my phone and showed him my call log. "I've been at work all day. I haven't called anyone except my ex-wife during my lunch break. You can check." Another deputy came out of my house. "Sir, did you give us permission to enter your residence?" "What? No, why are you in my house?" "Mrs. Patterson said you might be inside preparing to come to her residence to harm her. We did a safety sweep. Frank was going to have a field day with this." I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. "Officers, I want to be very clear. I have not threatened Brenda Patterson. I have not called her. I've been at my office all day with dozens of witnesses. This is a false report, and it's part of an ongoing harassment campaign she's been conducting against me for months." The deputies looked at each other. The first one said, "Do you have any proof of this harassment?" "Volumes of it. I have a lawyer who's been documenting everything. Can I call him?" They agreed, and I got Frank on the phone. He immediately demanded to know why they'd entered my house without permission or a warrant, and he informed them that if they found anything during their illegal search, it would be inadmissible, and we'd be filing a civil rights violation complaint. The deputies got defensive, but they also started looking less certain about the situation. Frank arrived 20 minutes later with a thick folder of documentation. He showed the deputies the timeline of Brenda's actions, the court transcripts from the HOA meeting and zoning board hearing, and the correspondence trail showing her escalating harassment. "My client has been the victim, not the perpetrator," Frank said. "Mrs. Patterson has made statements to witnesses about making his life miserable. She's filed frivolous complaints, issued baseless violations, and now she's apparently filing false police reports. That's a crime, by the way." The lead deputy, whose nameplate said Martinez, looked through the documentation with increasing concern. "Mr. Chen, I think we need to have a conversation with Mrs. Patterson about these allegations she's made." "I think that would be appropriate," Frank said. "I also think she needs to be informed that filing false police reports is a class of misdemeanor in Kentucky and can result in jail time." After the deputies left, I sat in my kitchen feeling shaky and angry. This had gone too far. Brenda wasn't just being a difficult HOA president anymore. She was actively trying to get me arrested on false charges. Frank sat across from me, his expression grim. "Quinn, this crossed a line. Filing a false police report is illegal, and if we can prove she did it knowingly, she could face criminal charges. But more importantly for our purposes, this gives us grounds for a restraining order and a substantial lawsuit." "I just want her to leave me alone," I said. "I want to live in my house with my kids and my animals without constant harassment." "I understand that. But sometimes the only way to make a bully back down is to hit them so hard they don't get back up. Let me handle this." Over the next week, things moved quickly. Frank filed for an emergency restraining order based on the false police report and the documented harassment. The judge granted a temporary order prohibiting Brenda from contacting me directly or coming within 500 feet of my property. We also filed a lawsuit against both Brenda personally and the HOA for harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and abuse of process. The false police report issue became more complicated when the deputies investigated further. They pulled phone records that showed the calls to Brenda hadn't come from my number. They'd come from a prepaid cell phone. But the voicemails had been recordings of my voice, taken from the zoning board hearing and edited to sound threatening. "Someone recorded you at the hearing and then spliced together audio to create fake threats," Frank explained. "That's not just a false report. That's fraud and potentially forgery. The deputies are treating this as a criminal investigation now." The police investigation focused on who had access to the recordings from the zoning board hearing and who had purchased prepaid phones in the area around the time of the incident. Security footage from a drugstore showed Brenda purchasing 2 prepaid phones 3 days before she filed the police report. When confronted with this evidence, Brenda's lawyer dropped her as a client. The police arrested Brenda on charges of filing a false report and criminal mischief. The HOA board, facing a lawsuit and the embarrassment of their president being arrested, voted unanimously to remove her from office and to settle our claims against the association. The settlement included a complete withdrawal of all violation notices against me, a written apology from the board, and reimbursement of my attorney fees. More importantly, it included a permanent injunction preventing the HOA from attempting to enforce any livestock restrictions against me or any other residents, unless such restrictions were properly added to the covenants through the legal amendment process. Brenda's criminal case took months to resolve. She initially tried to claim she'd been mistaken, that she genuinely believed I was threatening her, but the evidence was overwhelming. The prepaid phone purchases, the audio editing software found on her computer, and testimony from other residents about her vendetta against me painted a clear picture of deliberate false reporting. She eventually pleaded guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 6 months in jail, suspended on the condition of 2 years probation, community service, and restitution for the costs of the police investigation. She was also permanently banned from serving on the HOA board. The day her guilty plea was entered, I was collecting eggs with Marcus and Sophie. They'd been remarkably resilient through the whole ordeal, though I knew it had affected them more than they let on. Sophie, who was particularly attached to the goats, had been worried we'd have to give them away. "Dad, does this mean peanut and butter can stay forever now?" she asked, carefully placing eggs in the basket. "Yeah, sweetheart, they can stay." Marcus, always the more analytical one, looked up from where he was refilling the water dispenser. "That lady who was being mean, is she in jail now?" "She's not going to jail," I explained, "but she's not allowed to bother us anymore, and she can't be in charge of the neighborhood association anymore." "Good," he said with the simple certainty of a 10-year-old sense of justice. "She was mean to our chickens." Patricia called that evening to congratulate me and to share that the HOA board had elected her as the new president. "First order of business," she said, "is putting together actual, reasonable covenants that reflect what this community really is. We're forming a committee to review everything and propose updates. I'd like you to be on it." "I'm not sure I'm the best person for that," I said. "I think a lot of people still see me as the troublemaker who caused all this drama." "Quinn, you're not a troublemaker. You're a homeowner who stood up for your rights and exposed serious problems with how our HOA was being run. That took courage. We need people like you involved to make sure this never happens again." I agreed to join the committee, though I insisted on a limited role since I was still recovering from the stress of the past several months. The committee's work turned out to be fascinating. As we dug into the covenant documents and HOA history, we discovered that Brenda had been making up or misinterpreting rules for years. The approved paint colors that she'd insisted were required by the covenants didn't exist in any official document. The fence height restrictions she'd enforced, based on an unapproved proposal from 3 years ago that had never been voted on. The list went on. We spent 6 months cleaning up the covenants, removing ambiguous language, and adding clear procedures for how rules could be enforced. We also added protections for homeowners, including requirements that any violation notice include specific citation to the exact covenant provision being violated, and a reasonable opportunity to cure before fines could be assessed. The new covenants explicitly acknowledged that Meadowbrook Hills was an agricultural residential community, where small-scale livestock keeping was permitted subject to compliance with county regulations. We even added guidelines for best practices, like requiring adequate setbacks, proper waste management, and limits on noise-producing animals near property lines. Throughout this process, I got to know my neighbors in ways I never would have otherwise. I learned that George Mitchell had been a county extension agent before retiring and had expertise in small farming that he was happy to share. Patricia had a background in nonprofit management and brought much-needed organizational skills to the HOA board. Richard Holmes, who'd been on the board during Brenda's reign but had often disagreed with her privately, became a vocal advocate for transparent governance. The community slowly healed from the divisions Brenda's crusade had created. People who'd supported the livestock ban initially came around when they saw that the sky wasn't falling and property values weren't cratering. In fact, the community started attracting buyers who specifically wanted the rural residential character, and home prices actually increased slightly. My kids' Saturday morning animal tours became an official community event. We'd have 10 or 15 children show up to learn about chickens and goats and where food comes from. Parents would linger to chat, relationships formed, and the neighborhood felt more connected than it had when I'd first moved in. One Saturday morning, about a year after the whole ordeal had ended, I was showing a group of kids how to collect eggs when a family I didn't recognize approached. The father introduced himself as David Chen, no relation to my lawyer Frank, and said they were considering buying a house in the neighborhood. "We heard about what happened here," he said, "with the HOA president and the whole conflict over farm animals. To be honest, that's part of why we're interested. We've been looking for a place where we can have chickens and maybe a small garden, somewhere with a sense of community but also respect for individual property rights. This seems like it might be that place." I looked around at the kids laughing as they fed lettuce to the goats, at Patricia helping a nervous toddler hold an egg, at the well-maintained homes surrounding my property with their varied landscaping and personal touches. This was what Meadowbrook Hills was supposed to be, a place where people could live according to their values while being good neighbors. "Yeah," I said. "I think you'd like it here. The HOA is under new management." David laughed. "I read the court documents. They're public record." That former president really went off the deep end. She did, I agreed. But in a weird way, it made the community stronger. We had to really examine what kind of neighborhood we wanted to be. Turns out most people wanted freedom and flexibility over rigid rules and uniformity. The Chen family ended up buying a house 3 streets over. They got chickens 6 months later and became regular attendees at the Saturday morning farm tours. Their daughter and Sophie became best friends, bonding over their shared love of animals. 2 years after the initial conflict, the transformation of Meadowbrook Hills was complete. The community newsletter, which had once been full of violation warnings and reminders about rule compliance, now featured articles about gardening tips, recipes using backyard eggs, and profiles of residents' hobbies and interests. The annual HOA meeting, which used to draw maybe 20 people, now regularly had over 100 attendees who actually wanted to be involved in their community's governance. I never did expand my animal collection beyond the original chickens, goats, and ducks. Marcus and Sophie were getting older and busier with school activities, and the animals we had were plenty of work. But knowing I had the freedom to make that choice, rather than having it dictated by an arbitrary rule, made all the difference. Frank sent me a final bill marked "paid in full" when the legal matters were completely resolved. The settlement from the HOA had covered his fees, and he included a note saying it had been one of the most satisfying cases of his career. Not often I get to see actual justice done and a community improved in the process, he wrote. I framed that note and hung it in my home office, a reminder of what can happen when someone stands up for what's right, even when it's difficult and scary. I'd moved to Meadowbrook Hills wanting a simple life with space for my kids and animals. Instead, I'd gotten embroiled in an HOA nightmare that had consumed months of my life and cost me stress, money, and peace of mind. But I'd also gained something valuable. I'd learned that communities are defined by the people in them and the choices they make. When Brenda tried to impose her vision through bullying and manipulation, she ultimately lost because the community rejected that approach. When residents came together around shared values of freedom and mutual respect, the neighborhood became genuinely better. On a sunny morning in May, 3 years after I'd first heard that aggressive knock on my door, I was sitting on my back porch drinking coffee and watching Marcus and Sophie prepare the animals' morning feed. They worked together with practiced efficiency, a choreographed routine they'd perfected over countless repetitions. Sophie scattered grain for the chickens while calling them by name. They'd all been named after characters from her favorite books. Marcus filled water buckets and checked the duck pond's filter. They met at the goat pen where Peanut and Butter waited expectantly, their weird rectangular pupils giving them a perpetually judgmental expression that never failed to make me laugh. "Dad, can Emma come over later to help with the eggs?" Sophie called out. Emma was the Chen family's daughter. "Sure, if it's okay with her parents." "I'll text her mom," Sophie said, pulling out the phone she'd recently gotten for her 11th birthday. I watched my kids working with the animals and thought about how different things could have been. If I'd given in to Brenda's initial demands, if I'd removed the animals to avoid conflict, what would Marcus and Sophie have learned? That bullies win if you don't stand up to them. That it's easier to give up than to fight for what's right instead. They'd watched their father defend something that mattered, using the proper legal channels and community organizing rather than just accepting an unjust situation. They'd seen that standing up for yourself is hard and sometimes scary, but it's worth it. They'd also learned that you don't have to stand alone. Communities can come together to support what's right. These were lessons I hoped would serve them throughout their lives, far more valuable than anything a textbook could teach. Patricia stopped by later that afternoon to drop off the agenda for the next HOA meeting. She'd been an excellent president, bringing transparency and common sense to the role. Under her leadership, the association had actually become useful, organizing neighborhood events and maintaining common areas rather than obsessing over violations. "You know, I was talking to George the other day," she said, accepting a glass of iced tea. "He said you should run for the board next election. We've got 2 seats opening up." I considered it for a moment, then shook my head. "I appreciate the thought, but I think I'm better as a committee member. Let someone else have the spotlight. I've had enough drama to last a lifetime." Patricia laughed. "Fair enough. Though I have to say you handled it all remarkably well. A lot of people would have just moved away." "I thought about it," I admitted. "Especially during the worst of it when Brenda was filing those false police reports. But then I'd look at Marcus and Sophie and think about what message moving would send. That we run away when things get tough. That we let other people drive us out of our home. I couldn't do that." "Well, I'm glad you stayed. This community is better with you in it." After she left, I did my evening rounds of the animal enclosures, checking water levels and making sure all the gates were properly latched. It was a peaceful routine, meditative in its simplicity. The chickens were settling in for the night, arranging themselves on their roosting bars in their preferred hierarchy. The ducks were already asleep, heads tucked under their wings. Peanut and Butter watched me with mild interest from their shelter, chewing their cud. 3 acres, 11 animals, and more legal drama than I'd ever imagined possible. But standing there in the fading light, listening to the evening sounds of rural Kentucky, I knew I'd made the right choice in fighting for this life. The whole experience had taught me something important about homeowners associations and community governance in general. HOAs aren't inherently bad, despite their terrible reputation. They're tools, and like any tool, they can be used properly or misused. In the wrong hands, someone like Brenda Patterson, who saw the HOA as a way to impose her personal preferences on everyone else, they become instruments of harassment and petty tyranny. But in the right hands, they can actually enhance community life by coordinating shared interests and maintaining common values. The key is vigilance. Homeowners need to pay attention to who's running their HOA and what rules are being enforced. They need to read the actual covenants, not just accept what board members claim they say. They need to show up to meetings and vote, even when it's boring or inconvenient. Democratic governance requires participation, even at the mundane level of neighborhood associations. I'd learned these lessons the hard way, but at least I'd learned them, and I'd helped my community learn them too. Meadowbrook Hills would be less likely to fall under the control of another petty tyrant because residents had seen what could happen and had put safeguards in place. As the sun set behind my property, casting long shadows across the yard, I felt a deep sense of contentment. This wasn't the quiet, simple life I'd originally envisioned when I moved here. It had been complicated and stressful, and at times genuinely frightening. But it was mine, and I'd fought for it, and that made it all the more valuable. Marcus came out to tell me dinner was ready. He and Sophie had made spaghetti, one of the few meals they could prepare without supervision. As we sat down to eat, they chattered about their days, their plans for the weekend, their ongoing campaign to convince me that we needed a pig to complete the menagerie. "Pigs are a lot of work," I said, the same answer I'd been giving for months. "So are goats, and we have those," Sophie pointed out with airtight 10-year-old logic. "We'll see," I said, the universal parent response that means no but keeps the peace. After dinner, I helped with homework and then settled on the couch while the kids watched a movie. My phone buzzed with a text from Frank. "Saw in the legal notices that Brenda's probation ends next month. Thought you'd want to know she's moving to Florida. Clean slate for everyone." I felt a mix of relief and something like pity. Brenda had caused enormous problems for me and for the community, but she'd also paid a real price for her actions. A criminal record, legal fees, the embarrassment of being removed from the HOA position she'd clearly cared deeply about. I hoped she'd learned something from the experience, though I suspected she probably just felt like a victim of an unfair system. Some people never learn. They go through life blaming others for their problems, never recognizing their own role in creating conflict. Brenda seemed like one of those people. But that wasn't my problem anymore. She was moving away, and I could finally close this chapter completely. That night, after Marcus and Sophie went to bed, I stood at my bedroom window looking out over my property. The motion sensor lights illuminated the animal enclosures, security measures I'd kept even though the threat was long past. In the distance, I could see lights from neighboring houses, each one representing a family living their own version of the American dream in this little corner of rural Kentucky. This was home. Not just the house and land, but the community we'd built through conflict and controversy. We'd been tested and had emerged stronger for it. We'd learned who we were and what we valued. We'd discovered that freedom matters, that neighbors can support each other, and that standing up to bullies is worth the cost. The next morning was Sunday, and I took my time with coffee on the back porch while the kids slept in. The rooster crowed right on schedule, announcing the dawn to anyone who cared to listen. The goats bleated from their pen, demanding breakfast. The ducks quacked their way around the pond, searching for insects. It was just an ordinary morning in an ordinary neighborhood in Campbell County, Kentucky. But to me, it represented something extraordinary: the freedom to live according to my values, to raise my children with the lessons I thought important, and to be part of a community that respected individual choice while maintaining meaningful connections. 3 years ago, I never would have imagined I'd become the center of an HOA controversy that would end with arrests and zoning board hearings. I just wanted a place with enough land for some chickens and goats. Instead, I'd gotten a crash course in HOA law, community organizing, and standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. Would I have chosen this path if I'd known where it would lead? Probably not. But I was glad it had happened this way. The easy path isn't always the right one, and sometimes the fights we don't want to have are the ones we most need to fight. As the sun climbed higher and the morning warmed, I heard footsteps behind me. Sophie shuffled out in her pajamas, still half asleep, and climbed into my lap the way she'd done since she was a toddler. "Morning, Dad," she mumbled. "Morning, sweetheart. Can we make pancakes?" "Sure we can." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm glad we stayed here. I like our house." "Me too, Sophie, me too." And really, that was what it all came down to. My kids were happy. Our home was secure. The community was healthy. The animals were well cared for. Everything else, the legal battles, the HOA drama, the conflict with Brenda, was just the price we'd paid to get here. It was a price I'd gladly pay again if I had to, though I sincerely hoped I wouldn't need to. Once per lifetime of dealing with an HOA Karen trying to destroy your life over farm animals was quite enough. Thank you very much. Marcus joined us a few minutes later, and we went inside to make pancakes together, a Sunday morning tradition in the Yates household. As I mixed batter and supervised the griddle, listening to my kids argue about whose turn it was to flip the pancakes, I felt profoundly grateful for this ordinary moment. This was what I'd been fighting for all along. Not just the legal right to keep chickens and goats, but the ability to live the life I'd chosen for my family without unreasonable interference. The freedom to make pancakes on Sunday morning in a home we loved, in a community we'd helped shape, with animals waiting outside for their breakfast. By the time we'd finished eating and cleaning up, it was time for morning chores. The three of us went out together, and I watched Marcus and Sophie work with the easy competence that came from daily practice. They'd grown so much over the past 3 years, not just physically but in maturity and capability. The whole experience with the HOA had affected them, I knew. They'd seen their father stressed and worried. They'd been present for some of the difficult conversations. They'd feared losing the animals they loved. But they'd also seen that problems could be solved, that standing up for yourself mattered, and that communities could change for the better. Those were lessons worth learning, even if the process of learning them had been painful. After chores, Emma Chen arrived with her father David, and the 3 kids disappeared to play while David and I chatted about the upcoming neighborhood barbecue. These events had become regular occurrences under Patricia's HOA leadership, replacing the tense, rule-focused meetings of the Brenda era with actual community building. "You know, I was thinking," David said, "about writing up our experience here for one of those homeowner forums online. We spent 2 years looking for a place with an HOA that wasn't crazy, and Meadowbrook really is special now. Other people should know communities can change. Just make sure you mention it required fighting off a tyrant and going through the legal system," I said with a laugh. Set realistic expectations. True. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? That it's worth fighting for a good community, Too many people just accept bad HOA governance because they don't think they can change it. He was right. I'd almost been one of those people. If my lawyer hadn't been so knowledgeable, if my neighbors hadn't been supportive, if I'd been less stubborn or more willing to just give in for the sake of peace, things would have turned out very differently. But I hadn't given in. And now, 3 years later, I was sitting in my backyard on a beautiful Sunday morning, watching my kids play with their friends, surrounded by the animals that had sparked the whole conflict, living in a community that had fundamentally transformed for the better. Sometimes being stubborn pays off. Sometimes fighting back against petty tyranny actually works. Sometimes standing up for your rights leads to positive change, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. And sometimes, when an HOA Karen reports your farm animals as violations and tries to use every tool at her disposal to destroy your life, the zoning board really does laugh her out of the room. Justice doesn't always prevail, but when it does, it's sweet. That evening, after the Chens went home and dinner was finished and the kids were in bed, I did one final check of the animal enclosures. Everything was secure, all the animals healthy and content. Tomorrow would be Monday, back to the regular routine of work and school and ordinary life. But for tonight, I stood in my backyard under a sky full of stars, listening to the peaceful sounds of my small farm and felt completely at home. This was my land, my life, my choice. And no HOA Karen, no matter how determined or vindictive, had been able to take that away from me. The fight had been hard, but victory was mine. And it tasted like fresh eggs, goat milk, and the freedom to live according to my own values in a community that respected individual rights while maintaining meaningful connections. It tasted like home.